I was talking about Secret of the Mimic the other day on my weekly podcast, and we came to a sort of epiphany, one that I think not only ties Secret of the Mimic together with the rest of the timeline, but finally might tell us where the rest of the story is heading from here. And it has to do with the battle over the Mimic, not from the Mimic itself. Slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. We know the Mimic is involved with the overarching story of Security Breach, but the question has always been, why? Even before Secret of the Mimic came out, once we heard about the Mimic from the books, and even more so, once we played through Ruin and saw that endoskeleton at the very end of it, we knew for a fact that the Mimic was crucial and vital to frankly every game since Help Wanted. And looking back over it with the Mimic's influence in mind, there have been breadcrumbs all along. The way Glitchtrap acts is incredibly indicative of a Mimic program. The way that it recreates things in Pizza Party. Hell, the way in Security Breach, there are several rooms that are recreations of Help Wanted rooms. In Help Wanted 2, the idea that we have to teach endoskeletons with this memory game, or the Endomaze in general. In Help Wanted 2, the idea of Projector Helpy being this character that's kind of talking to us. And then obviously in Ruin, we have the Mimic, but we also have Helpy in the mask talking to us the whole time. There are signs of the Mimic all over these games, but the motivation, or the reason, has always been a mystery. Why is the Mimic still around? What is its goal? How does it tie into Glitchtrap and the Pizzaplex? Well, I think I finally figured it out. And it's not actually the Mimic or M2's specific goal, but it's the goal of the people and entities around it. The big reveal of Secret of the Mimic is twofold. It's the idea that there are actually at least two Mimics. First was M1. It was the original Mimic that was trained on Fiona to become a better caretaker for David, Edwin Murray's son, and of course Fiona being Edwin Murray's wife. Edwin then worked on trying to recreate the Mimic so it could be a sellable product. But when his son David died, M1 began pressuring Edwin into making another Mimic to train on David. M1's main programming now is to take care of a child. Without a child, she is lost. So she wants Edwin to make M2 to be David. And eventually this begins to work when he makes a copy of M1's code and begins training that on David. But eventually he comes to his senses and realizes that all of this is an insane mistake that he's making, and he stops working on it. But it's too late, as M2 is already starting to mimic David. This is too much for him, and he beats the robot senseless, to which then later it tricks and traps Edwin into getting himself killed in the office, and M2 is on its own. Now, when I say M1 is Fiona, I don't like saying M2 is David. After all, it's really not. M2 is more of a conglomeration of a few characters. There's bits of David, bits of the characters that it tries to copy, and even bits of Edwin. Of course, all laced with the violence that Edwin taught it, whether that be through agony or just rote programming. But M2 is the program in the endoskeleton, likely the thing we see at the end of Ruin, while M1 is at this point just a program within one of the experimental storage containers. So the question that needs to be answered is, if these two existed in the 70s, what's happened from then to now? Obviously, a major chunk of the timeline is in the middle, and we still don't have much information on what that could be. One possible explanation posited is also by T-Dreads. He's the guy who made Schedule Theory last week. His theory is called God David, and I'm not really going to go into it right now because it's not super relevant. Obviously, you should go and watch the full video since it's a good video, but I brought him on the podcast to talk about that theory, and it's in that conversation where I kind of settled on Mimic custody. Because the thing that keeps holding me back from being a true believer in God David is why William Afton would want to turn the crying child into Dave. Or at least why William Afton would want to help Fiona recreate David. I kept being hung up on William Afton's nature and a lack of motivation for that part of the theory, but that's when I realized maybe William Afton isn't helping to recreate David, but maybe he started with that goal in mind. So what happens after Secret of the Mimic? Well, we know for a fact that Fazbear Entertainment, and by extension William Afton, reclaims all of the property that Edwin Murray once owned. They mention in the email that he would never touch his house, but once Edwin Murray turns up dead, that's easy pickings. But if that's the case, and William Afton and Fazbear Entertainment got their hands on the entire Murray's Costume Manor, what would William Afton see when he got there? Now, this is a bit controversial, but for this theory M3 to work, the first ending of Secret of the Mimic needs to be canon. No, not the secret ending, and not the ending where we keep the data diver, confront the Mimic, and confront Fiona, set everything on fire, and escape, kind of, but rather the first ending, where Arnold just simply hands over the data diver to who he thinks is Dispatch, leaves, is killed by the Mimic, and we cut to M2 being entertained by a showtime in research and development. The reason this ending needs to be canon is it so cleanly keeps everything together and contained. If this ending truly happened before William Afton takes over the entire location, then when William Afton gets down to research and development, a room he would know existed because that's where the Fazbear Project is, he would find M2 watching a show in his prototype pizzeria and find M1 being the one directing it. From everything we know about William Afton, this would be one of the most fascinating things he's seen so far in the timeline. So when he eventually meets M1, she informs him of what's going on. M2 is meant to be David, but he needs to be repaired with the original Mimic schematics, so she's waiting for Edwin to finally come down and fix M2. And it's then that William would likely inform M1 that Edwin is dead. But William Afton is an inventor himself, and he might be able to help Fiona recreate David. Now, why would William Afton want to do this? Well, one, it would probably be fascinating for him, but two, if he could recreate David and maintain the Mimic schematics, not only could he experiment on these two things, but he would have an incredibly helpful product on his hands. But to be safe, he needs to work on and better understand the Mimic schematics before attempting to upload them to M2. So he leaves out the back way the same way that Arnold would in the second ending, and ends up in the bunker laboratories underneath Edwin's house. He begins studying the schematics, but quickly realizes he needs a safer environment to properly test on the Mimic schematics. Luckily, Edwin Murray has already created such a container. In fact, he's created two. Earlier in the game, in Edwin's office in the factory, we see on the monitor experimental storage number 2, which is where the Mimic schematics are held. And later, in his office in his house, we see mechanical X-form experimental storage 1, which is where Cradle.exe is capable of being run. I think it's very clear that these are both referring to two separate mechanical X-form experimental storage containers. The game just didn't want to spoil what that meant halfway through the game. And this makes sense. The first mechanical X-form experimental storage was made and labeled likely as MXES, but when making the second one for M1's programming, it was instead labeled F10N4. Otherwise, somebody for some reason during this timeline came and carved a different name into this console, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But if Fiona is in Fiona, then MXES is likely empty, which is where William Afton could deposit the Mimic schematics and better experiment on them. So William uploads a copy of the Mimic schematics, essentially making M3. And once it's in there, he begins training it on himself to see if he can properly get the program to work and make a copy of William Afton. So all of this is happening during the late 70s to early 80s. And while William Afton is working on M3, other Fazbear buildings start to be built around the property. The old Murray Manor is eventually rebuilt into the FNAF 4 house. Murray's costume manor is pretty much gone, and now a new Fredbear's Family Diner is built in its place. Over time, the underground bunker underneath Murray's house is being converted into the sister location bunker, and R&D is being left relatively untouched for fear of disturbing M2. All the while, William Afton is still trying to turn M3 into a copy of himself. This leans on a theory I made before Secret of the Mimic came out. The idea that William could see this as a form of immortality. This might be where his whole obsession with living forever comes from. He goes to the Murray's Costume Manor and finds Fiona, a woman he thought was long dead, but has been recreated digitally in M1. If William Afton can figure out how to turn M3 into a good copy of himself, even if William Afton were to die, this version of him would go on to live forever and continue enacting what his will would want. I also think part of it is William seeing this as a challenge to conquer, something that Edwin couldn't do and he could. Another way he could prove himself better than his others. Join down, and want me to change how I'm holding. Ooh, how's this? Ooh, is that good? Is that nice? At this point, the Aftons have fully moved into the FNAF 4 house, and the crying child has moved into David's old room, explaining why it appears in his nightmares. But as William tired away and focused on making M3 into William Afton, his neglect of his own children caught up to him, much like Edwin himself, and the crying child gets bit at Fredbear's the bite of 83, something that sends him into a coma and later kills him. This sends William Afton over the edge. This can't be. He's an excellent businessman, an innovator, someone much better than anyone around him. Of course, this is his own narcissism talking, but in this obsession over making M3 into himself, he's falling into the same exact trap that Edwin Murray did. Edwin Murray obsessed over the mimic, so much so that his wife and his son died while he ignored the both of them. He's obviously better and smarter and more efficient than Edwin Murray could ever be, but here he is, being obsessed over the mimic to the point where his own son dies from his negligence. He can't believe it. His story can't end like this. He can't be Edwin Murray. Edwin was a naive fool, one so stupid that he was able to crush his business like a grape and savor its flavors. But here he was, being stumped by the same puzzle. No, he was better than Edwin Murray. Edwin couldn't recreate David into M2, so he would do what Edwin couldn't. He would put his son back together again. Casey cameo for as long as he lets me. This is why and when William Afton builds the FNAF 4 testing chambers. In case you need to be caught up, it's incredibly likely that there were actual underground chambers that looked very similar to the FNAF 4 nightmares, and they were attached to the sister location bunker in order to study the effects of fear on people. We see this described in Dinophobia, and several pieces of evidence since then seem to point into that direction. The question has always been, why? Well, this might be the initial reason why. After all, this is right after William received these underground bunkers to experiment in, and he's now trying to make M2 into his own son. His son who was absolutely terrified of animatronics. It would take a lot of effort to make the mimic something built to be an animatronic, afraid of them. So he builds the FNAF 4 chambers directly next to the research and development prototype pizzeria, and leads M2 inside of it, locking it in and subjecting it to endless recreations of nightmares. Fiona obviously objects to this, but it's not her experiment to dictate. William Afton leaves her there. She can't control that much, and she was already low on power when William arrived. He then moves the MXES console nearby to oversee the experiments of M2 while he continues to train M3 to better recreate himself. And also it gives him free time to work on his other budding experiments, the Funtime animatronic, something that would be directly connected to this bunker. But eventually, he's still too obsessed with this and too deep into all of these experiments to truly watch his own children. And another one of his children, Elizabeth Afton, dies because of that negligence. But in William's mind, this is the second child that Michael Afton was supposed to be watching over and died on his watch. Enough is enough. William pulls M2 out of the FNAF 4 chambers. Maybe it's been enough time, maybe it hasn't. But Michael needs to learn a lesson, and William's starting to get curious as to what this chamber would do to a human person. So he puts M2 back into the research and development pizzeria to keep it locked away, and puts Michael Afton into the FNAF 4 nightmare chambers for the time being. But he doesn't want to look at this mess in the day-to-day anymore, so he pulls M3 out of the MXES console back into the data diver to continue experimenting on it elsewhere. But it's around this time that William notices the strange characteristics of Circus Baby after the death of Elizabeth, and starts to suspect possession. It's something that's been nagging at the back of his mind ever since he listened to that one tape where Edwin seemed convinced that Fiona was possessing M1. Maybe possession was real, and if so, could that then be manipulated? And this is when William Afton would begin researching possession and later remnant, all with M3 tucked away in his data diver. Cut to many years later, after FNAF 6, after everything is settled and everyone is dead, Fazbear Entertainment is making a comeback. Somebody buys up the company trying to flip it and make a quick buck on selling it. But first things first, they have to save its dying reputation. It's riddled with crime scenes and news stories. So the CEO decides to release a VR game, making a bit of fun of itself and telling the public, look, this is what I mean, he likes to play. All that's in the past, we're not like that anymore. And after pilfering through Fazbear's old tech to try to find anything to help create this, they encounter something called a data diver. They're not quite sure what it is, but looking into it, there's plenty of very sophisticated coding. But it is Fazbear proprietary technology, so they can't just leave it with anyone. They send it to the third party making the VR game to scan it in and reclaim it before they can figure out exactly what it is. And at first, it works wonders. It begins unfolding several animatronics and pathing sites and locations and characters. And then some testers notice that it begins to form its own character. I think it's at this point that Glitchtrap is inputted into Help Wanted from the data diver. This digital recreation of William Afton quickly realizes that this world isn't real. A place it can just manifest things surely must be some sort of digital realm. So mission 1 is get out of here. It immediately looks for a body in the real world and notices that occasional humans come in to poke around. He fails on the first and second attempt, but the third tester seems a bit more malleable and willing to dig deeper where others wouldn't, and he's able to claw his way into her mind, and as he's learned is possible from M1's testimony, makes a copy of his own code to input into her mind, making Vanessa into Vanny, or in this case, M4. Using her, it learns of what's become of Fazbear since it's been locked away, learns of the failed businesses and the buried locations. It realizes that if it really truly wants to return to this world, it needs a proper body. And it has a feeling that M2, or possibly even William Afton's original corpse, may still be in that old R&D building. So Glitchtrap, or M3, or fittingly, as I think I might start calling it, Malhair. Now this name is not new, Malhair has been around for a while, but if you all caps it, you can lead speech it with M and 3. M3, Malhair. I like that a lot. But Malhair begins to infiltrate the company's systems, slightly directing it and guiding it into ways that are more advantageous for itself. A Pizzaplex was already being built, but why not build it on that free plot of land you already own? And why not be a bit more lax about the construction rules, so me and this random security guard can go dig down and find the old bunker underneath. And eventually they do find the research and development pizzeria, although they note that it's been changed fairly drastically. It seems like Henry Emily must have meddled with it in the meantime. Regardless, they uncover the M2 mimic endoskeleton, but it's still active and still as violent as ever. They need to take M2 out of that endoskeleton so Malhair can be inputted into it. This would be the perfect body for Malhair to become William Afton again, but that damn mimic M2 is still stuck in it. They need the Mexis console, and they need it to be functional to use Cradle.exe and get M2 out of the endoskeleton. But neither of them are able to crack it. They need someone who's slightly better at programming than the either of them. So they then target Gregory, a child who seems to have an incredible aptitude for coding and programming. Now, while all of this is happening, when they uncovered the old bunker, M2 isn't the only thing they dug up. M1 was still down there as well, and begins influencing the Pizzaplex and everything she can around them to stop them and protect M2 from William Afton's clutches. And that's what I think the current story of Security Breach is. M1 and M3, or Malhair, or Glitchtrap as is familiarly called, fighting over the control of the body of M2. M1 wants to leave M2 as is and return it to David so she can have her son again. And William Afton, or Glitchtrap, or Malhair, or M3 wants a fresh, new, usable body to come back to life in. So where does M2 fall in all of this? What are M2's motivations? What does M2 want? Well, unfortunately, that's a theory for another day. But rest assured, I don't think M2 wants either of those outcomes. I think this makes a lot of sense, and it tracks with a lot of what we know about these characters. The problem, admittedly, is still a lack of evidence in the middle of this timeline, but pretty much any theory is going to have a similar lack of evidence in the middle of the timeline, because we just have a lack of information in the middle of the timeline. But let me know what you think. This theory is not without its problems, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it down below. In the meantime, if you want to hear the discussion that led to this theory, that was on this week's Freddy Fazbear Pizza podcast episode, which you can find right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with hashtag ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.